Marion. The title was given to me by Marion when twisting my arm. It's not quite appropriately reflecting what I'm going to say because, as you will have gathered from the introduction, I've got a background much more in technical scientific stuff than I have on day-to-day management, but I think we've got a role to play in that. And I want to follow up on a couple of points that we've heard already, and one of them is that 3 speakers in a row commended Dr. Michael Taylor. Michael Taylor was my first scientist in charge when I worked in what was called the Water and Soil Science Centres. But prior to that, Michael Taylor had started his career surveying populations of the North Atlantic sea cod, Gaddis gaddis. He came to New Zealand to Cawthron Institute. He became the chief scientist at the Auckland Regional Authority and its Mangere Wastewater Treatment Plant in particular. He then went to the Ministry of Works Water and Soil Division and was my research manager, among many other people's research manager. He then went to DSIR, and then he went to Ministry of Health to do water supply stuff. Now, why am I telling you this? Michael had a tremendously broad range of experience and environments. And what we're hearing now is, how are we going to replace this? And let me just make a little plea here. I think that the current funding set up for research institutes is a bit of a barrier to that, because it's hard to get fast decisions to put in a substantial effort to help unless you've got some really very willing parties around the Michael Taylors of this world. So that's a little plea. Second point, we heard a lot this morning about the onus of proof, and I've dealt a lot with that question in various statistical forums. And can I suggest a use of language that I think is the most appropriate and most easily understood, and it comes from industrial statistics, and that is you've got a consumer's risk and a producer's risk. The consumer is us drinking water, the producer is the supplier of the water. What are we doing? We want to minimise the consumer's risk. That's good public health practice. And that's well understood among the statistical community, but consumer's risk, producer's risk seems to roll off the tongue nicely, and what's more, if you minimise one, you maximise the other. And the only way to get out of that, if it's causing you a problem, is get more data. The third point is that Nigel referred to the study by Till and others, published in 1998. That was a survey of 25 recreational water sites around New Zealand. It was surveyed fortnightly for 15 months for a bunch of indicators and pathogens, including Campylobacter. Every one of those 25 sites showed at least one instance of Campylobacter. 6% of those samples were greater than the upper detection limit, which is 110 Campylobacter per 100 millilitres. People were very surprised to hear that there's a lot of Campylobacter in what environments that should have been pretty clean, because people have chosen to swim there. And that's why our recreational water standards are based on a risk analysis for Campylobacter. It's precisely because all that was found everywhere as it was, and it is directly a pathogen. So, enough of that. All I need to do is figure out how this works. So, in a nutshell, 3 main issues that come out from the inquiry to me are, one is decent communication, and all these barriers that we're hearing about and the barriers between science and management don't help. The importance of system understanding and maintenance, understanding risk assessment. And the inquiry indicates to me that understanding associated technical issues is involved in all 3 and needs to be enhanced. So, for example, to develop a common understanding among all parties of at least an outline of the key technical details, most people don't know what zoonosis means. It's actually the illness. The pathogen is zoonotic pathogen. For example, little things like that. But the leaching to groundwater, we need to have people to understand. Second is to know your catchment and its history and use on the web. You know, we could tell you things about what happens in streams that are probably going to surprise you. And that is, when we have a flood event, we get an enormous increase in microbial contamination, but it's not the same shape as the flood event. You get a peak of the pathogen earlier than the flood peak because it's washing off from local sources. And that means that at a given flow, if you're sampling on the rising limb, you'll get a much higher result for the pathogen than on the falling limb. So if you took a flood sample at the wrong time, you'd be lulled into a false sense of security. Now, we know all that stuff. There's a guy in the audience, John Nagels, who's been heavily involved in developing that, and he's done good work. And it's frustrating that this is so difficult to get through to forums. That's why I've and others have been so involved, in ESR particularly, involved in this organisation, because we want to have a better interchange between science and water management, including water supply delivery. Thirdly, I think we need to consider all 6 steps, quantitative or qualitative, and it's usually qualitative rather than quantitative, and that's fine. Risk assessment. I come to this particularly from having done a lot of quantitative microbial risk assessments, QMRA, around the country, and you have to have a very clear understanding of what these steps are. First, set the risk context. Fairly obvious, I think. Then identify the hazards. So you need to go and have this communication with the Nigel Frenches of this world to see what should we be considering and under what circumstances. When do we look at norovirus? Is rotavirus something that we should consider coming from animals? Those kind of discussions need to be had. Then you need to examine the exposure to those pathogens. In swimming, it's ingestion of water. In drinking water, it's ingestion of yet more water, which should be of a higher quality. And then you need to select dose response functions, and I've got a real hobby horse about this, as you'll see in a minute. And calculate numerical qualitative risk profiles. We need to be able to get over, maybe in using a traffic light approach, but in the context of taking a precautionary approach, what might the risks be? And we need to communicate them, and their associated uncertainties. Because if you're uncertain, and we often are, and I'll show you why, how do we interpret that? Do we put some kind of confidence limit or a tolerance interval on it? Then which part of the interval do we take? Well, you take the worst case because you're being precautionary, which is proper public health practice. So what we had in Havelock North was a perfect storm, just like this. And how did it happen? There was heavy antecedent rainfall. We could have told people that when you get heavy rainfall like that, you are running big risks of getting a lot of microbial contamination everywhere. John and others did a study on a stream in the Waikato, which has a water supply reservoir up the top, and we allowed there was an artificial flood that we generated, and the concentration in the water goes from on the order of 100 E. coli per 100 mil to 40,000. It's about equivalent to what David Kay was saying this morning for fecal coliforms, I think it was. It's 10 to the 5 and more, well, 10 to the 4 and more order of magnitude. There's inadequate oversight of drinking water delivery systems. I don't want to get into that because it's not my field, as I say, and equipment maintenance. Failure to understand the risks posed by animal wastes compared with human wastes. There was a study published in Connecticut for Connecticut streams for people using recreational water and pond system, which came to the conclusion there was no association between the degree of fecal contamination and the health risks to swimmers. It's a load of rubbish. Of course there's an association. If you know your statistics, what that study found was a p-value of 0.059. If you get 0.049, you say this is statistically significant. If you don't, you say it's not. And I say, well, so what? This is gobbledygook. You need to ask sensible questions. And usually you do find something. How often do you measure things and find nothing? The real question there is, what have we found and how confident are we that it reflects reality? That's a hobby horse of mine, another one. Dirty dairying. This is a really interesting one to me. When the Havelock North thing hit the fan, what did we see on the TV screens? Cattle. Why? Because it's dirty dairying. I believe this is operating at a subconscious level, because if you know the catchment, you know there's very few cattle there and they're quite a long way away. There's a lot of sheep. Oh, sheep are fine. What's the problem with sheep? It's dirty dairying. Well, in that study that I mentioned where the 25 sites sampled fortnightly for 15 months, we found that the sheep-dominated catchments were just as contaminated microbially as were the cattle-dominated catchments. And yet that's not very well known. That's probably a fault of mine for not making it more clear and advertising more often, but I guess you can only do so much. And here comes the other hobby horse. I don't believe there's any such thing as the infectious dose. I think that if your health status varies from 1 week to another, if you're not well and you get subjected to a dose of Campylobacter, you're more likely to come down with Campylobacteriosis. Individuals, it's age dependent, it's previous health dependent, it's naturally dependent. Individuals show different susceptibilities to your pathogen. So you can get this. This is actually a really, if you think about what's going on here, a really stunning graph. The blue line is the standard model for the dose response of Campylobacter dose to infection. That's whether or not you're displaying symptoms, you are actually infected. It's measured by presence in your stools, for example. And that was adults in a clinical trial with an old laboratory culture, had been cultured in the laboratory for some years. And if you look at that graph, there's a logarithmic scale on the x-axis. you need to get 800 of that order, 800 Campylobacter before there's 50% chance that a group would become ill, that 50% of them would become ill. It's called the ID50 for infection. But in 2005, Peter Tunis from the Dutch Institute published a paper on a reconsideration of the Campylobacter-Dosa relationship. This was on the basis of a bunch of children going to 2 schools in the Netherlands and in England, becoming infected with Campylobacter and ill. And he has inferred that dose-response relationship in the red line. There is an enormous difference between these 2 dose-response functions. What are we going to do about it? It's actually a live issue in the quantitative risk assessment literature right now, because most people in the papers that I review just select one. They don't even acknowledge the existence of the other one. But the strict red one there is what's become more and more prevalent in its use. My view of this is I think that that's a perfect storm as well, and that the blue line is definitely not a perfect storm, and somewhere between the two we should be sampling statistically to determine what the risk should be. Here's another hobby horse, the beat goes on. I'm actually concerned that we're focused too much on these large outbreaks, because we need to remember the pattern of illness is, in the number of cases here, for an outbreak or epidemic occurs above the outbreak detection level, but below it, there's undetected outbreaks, there's endemic patterns and sporadic. And you think about that and you think, I wonder what the burden is of the endemic sporadic cases versus outbreak. Guess who wins? Well, Jamie Bartram knows, because he wrote something in this book, didn't you, Jamie? Probably the vast majority of waterborne disease burden arises outside of detected outbreaks. What that says to me is there's no room for complacency. You're not just trying to avoid an outbreak, you're trying to minimise what goes on from day to day, and that has implications for how you design, fund and operate drinking water treatment works. Recognising that this Campylobacter was a bit of an issue, a few years ago a research study was set up of modelling Campylobacteriosis, its links between with the environment. Nigel was heavily involved in that. We started off with models like that and got even more complicated, and I'm not going to go through any detail here, but when you take one look at this diagram and you think of the politician that was mentioned early today, that it's food related, it's chicken related and nothing else matters, you take a look at the flow diagrams here, you're right, there are other ways you can get it. And by the way, if it's food related, it didn't grow on the food. So where did it come from? Crudely, it came from the backside of an animal. And how did it get onto the food? Well, there has to be a delivery chain there somewhere, doesn't there? So water is often implicated in that. So we need to realise that the direct water-related outbreaks from drinking water might not be the total total water exposure cause. And once again, we have this graph. This is a source attribution study that was published by our study. Our study is on the web, but it never got much made of, and the government changed. And if you look there at the poultry, that's not a poultry effort. Bad pun. That's the intervention, and the effect of the intervention that took place in 2006. It more than halved. It's the most dramatic thing I think I've ever seen in science, really. It more than halved the notified disease burden. And that was a fabulous achievement. It would be nice to think that we could do some more with those other ones. And if you look up the top there, remainder including drinking water and other animal contact, that's about 10% of the burden. So some of that at least is coming from, arguably, small water supplies. It's undetected, small populations. One or two people get ill, or it wasn't the water. And how do you confirm it anyway? It's too small to see. Finally, climate change. We can expect, on average, more intense rainfall, increased temperatures, and more frequent contact of pathogens with food, animals, and humans. So we can expect more zoonoses to be reported as climate changes, as it seems to be. Conclusions: got to communicate better and cut down those barriers between science and management, in particular, my field. Understand risk assessment. Those 6 steps should be known by everybody, and they can be qualitative. They don't have to be quantitative and do a lot of modelling and all that stuff. System maintenance is obviously important, and there is no room for complacency. We're not just avoiding outbreaks. We're trying to minimise the total burden. And strains of some species have very different virulence, and we need to think about what that is. And if you need any confirmation of that, there have been 6 trials, clinical trials of cryptosporidium, and 5 of them were cryptosporidium parvum, 1 was hominis. The ID50s between those 6 trials varies by over 2 orders of magnitude. Same species, different strains, right? So, need to think about that. Thank you.